Excellent. Well, first, thank you for the sponsors for inviting me today. It's a great privilege to be here. It's actually been, I was thinking, probably 10 years since the last time I was in Israel, so it's fantastic to return, and especially to correspond with the same year my son was bar mitzvahed, so to be back here is very meaningful to me. I'm Adam Bergman. I am a managing director in Citi's Clean Energy Transition Group, and I'm also the global head of AgTech investment banking. I like to tell people that I work from farm to fork, but I don't cover food and I don't cover agriculture. I cover all the technology that's disrupting the food and ag sector. So for me, this is a great place to be amongst people who are seeing a lot of the fantastic innovation that's happening here. I'd start off by saying, when I used to talk about this sector, I'd frequently start off on a page talking about sustainability. But it's very clear to me that things have changed dramatically over the past 6 to 9 months, and any conversation about the food system does not start with sustainability anymore. Very clearly, it starts with food security. And as we sit here in Israel, knowing very close by in Egypt, they're starting talks at COP27, we know food security is at the forefront. Citi happens to be an advisor to the Egyptian government. Our whole team is over in Egypt now working on ways to help with food security. For those who haven't seen it, Citi put out a food security report yesterday I could share with the sponsors and they could distribute to everyone. But this is the topic that people around the world are talking about. I'd love to say that sustainability is still at the forefront of where everyone's minds is. That just doesn't happen to be the case at this moment. We will get back there at some point, but today, food security is the topic that people are discussing, and really they're discussing it for a few reasons. One, because of what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. Two, because we've got rising inflation, which is impacting both the cost of food and the cost of energy. Three, we have extreme weather events. For those following the weather, this is going to be a very challenging year for people who are going to be looking at the amount of crops that are produced and how much is available. We've seen challenges with crop inputs as well. Prices are going up, which is making things more challenging for farmers. And then the last one, which I actually think is going to fundamentally change the food system, is we saw prolonged export bans of key agricultural products in a number of countries. And because of this, it's changing how people approach food, and it's forcing a number of wealthier developing countries to take money and start to invest into food self-sufficiency. In my estimation, we're going to enter a period of food deglobalization, likely for the first time since before World War II, which is incredibly important to have as a context. So with security at the forefront, it's very important to also be thinking about sustainability, because we're going to get back to this. So what are we talking about? How do we build a sustainable food system? If you think about it, for the last 50 years, the focus was on production and yield. And if you go back to that point in the 1970s and start reading some of the journals and academic papers, everyone was talking about, we're going to run out of food. And that was really the main focus. Well, what changed? Well, we used technology and innovation to fundamentally change the food system. We significantly increased yields, and we're actually in a food system today where I think society is much better off in terms of production. So while there is hunger and there are challenges, it's not because we don't produce enough food. Unfortunately, the industrial agriculture sector led to a number of major challenges. First, we had tremendous environmental damage that's happened to soil, to groundwater, to lakes, rivers, streams, and oceans. Secondly, we started growing what I'd call cheap and empty calories, and it's led to an obesity epidemic that's really negatively impacting our health system. And third is one that's near and dear to me and probably many of you. The quality and taste of the food we eat, particularly produce, is inferior to what it used to be. And much of that is because we grow today not for taste, but for logistics and yield. And that's another thing that's a challenge. At the second issue here is there's been a change on the consumer side. We used to live in a world where the consumer was a taker. The consumer went to a grocery store to buy products. If they didn't have the products you needed, you bought what was there or you left empty-handed. That has fundamentally changed, and COVID actually even drove it quicker. What we see today is a society where the consumer's in charge. A consumer goes into a grocery store, if they don't have what they want, they don't buy it. They go home, they can buy it online. A lot of people don't even go to grocery stores anymore, they just buy online. They use meal delivery, they get meal kits sent to the house. The consumer has fundamentally changed how our food system works because they are no longer a taker, they are driving change to retailers and CPG. And third is the impact of climate change. I know we all think about climate change and it's something that is on our mind. However, I look at it very different. To me, climate change isn't the world's getting warmer, the world's getting drier. If that was our only challenge, we would deal with that. The problem is we have extreme weather events happening very frequently. When you have once-in-a-generation weather events happening every 2 to 3 years, it's fundamentally impacting how we grow and impacting our ability to grow, which is going to be a continued issue. So what do we have for technology to drive change? So if you look here, I like to say from farm to fork, we are seeing fundamental changes happening throughout the whole food system. You look at something like ag biotech. We're looking at innovation. How are we going to replace chemicals? How are we going to replace fertilizers? How are we going to replace pesticides? All of that is going to be impactful. Secondly, how are seed genetics going to fundamentally change growing? We've been growing one way for a long time, but you know what? If you're a farmer, you're going to need to figure out how you grow with less water, how you grow with less fertilizers, chemicals, and pesticides. And the innovations in biotechnology are going to be at the forefront there in seed genetics. On the animal side, I think we all expect to be a reduction in the amount of animals that are consumed 10, 20, 30 years in the future. But animal protein's not going away, so we better figure out ways to be more efficient with our animal protein, figure out how we can change the feed system, and make this sector much more productive. Two areas that I think are very interesting, and I like to give context. If you go back to the start of this really growth at ag tech, back in about 2014 to 2018, we saw tremendous growth and investment in what I call ag biotech, which is really the left here. It's the farm. What's happening on the farm? What's happening in distribution? It really mirrored the work I had done previously in the clean tech sector, where most of it is B2B. The challenge with B2B is whether you sell to a farmer or a processor, or you sell to electric utility, an energy company, or automotive sector, it takes a long time. What we saw really starting in about 2019 was a real big shift where a consumer was there focused on sustainability. And that consumer said, I want to drive change in the food and ag system. Well, they're not going to buy a lot of the products on the left because they're not farmers. But what do they buy? Well, they consume food. So what we saw from about 2019 to the beginning of this year was a fundamental growth in the amount of adoption of alternative proteins in indoor farming, which is a trend that's going to continue. However, we've seen a change this year, likely driven by a couple things. One being the rising price of fertilizer, another being the rising price of crops, where all of a sudden we've seen an increased interest looking back again at the ag biotech, at the ag tech sector, and we've seen a lot more investment coming in again into the side around automation and digital ag. And what I'm seeing is the beginning of a fundamental change where the farm is going to be at the forefront of a tech innovation world. And what do I mean? Well, if you go back 3 decades and think about the manufacturing sector, 3 decades ago, the manufacturing sector was labor intensive, it did not use technology, and was highly inefficient. If you fast forward to where the ag sector is going, the farm of the future is going to be digitally enabled. It's going to have sensors, it's going to have IoT, it's going to have software solutions. The farmer at his hand, her hand, with an iPad's going to be able to have full control, full knowledge, and the ability to make a better profit than they have in the future. And I think that's really important. But automation and robotics and the digital ag together are going to drive a couple interesting things. One's going to be a change to get towards carbon sequestration. We have a huge issue ahead of us where there is an enormous differentiation between the amount of carbon credits that are in demand and the amount of carbon credits that are in supply. The ag sector can be a huge leader in driving that change by sequestering carbon. The challenge is today, the verification components of it are very challenging, but as we get robotics and automation on the farm, we're going to be able to do that effectively. The other thing that's going to be a big change is fintech. Having come working at a bank and having worked previously at an ag bank, I can tell you fundamentally, banks don't get ag. While banks' job is to mitigate risk, the digital side and ag don't mix. So you're going to have a lot of non-bank lenders, you're going to have people in crop insurance coming in who are going to incredibly change how lending, insurance happens in the food and ag sector, particularly in farming. So when we get forward and move to what's happening here, you've got a couple other things I want to point out. One of the biggest challenges we all face today is food waste. It's shocking to me how much food is waste. Claims of 30 to 40% of food that is grown is not consumed. It's a huge issue. If you're a country like Israel, if you're a country like China, who already has food insecurity issues, you cannot waste food. We're seeing a lot of innovations in technology that are going to be really important there. The supply chain is another component. There's huge waste, there's huge inefficiency, but digitization is going to help to reduce that. On the food tech side, I think we've all seen the beginnings. We saw plant-based protein, let's call it 2.0, rise up in the last couple of years. It faced some challenges. I still am bullish on this, but what I think people need to fundamentally remember, consumers are not going to change and move to some new product, whether it's sustainable, whether it's animal welfare, or any other reason, unless it tastes good, and the products out there aren't good enough yet. And I like to say the 90% of consumers who are not vegetarian or vegan aren't going to shift for an inferior product. So we have a lot of work to do there. On indoor farming, we've seen a lot of change happening. We've seen a lot of innovation. We've seen a movement from greenhouses to the beginning of vertical farms. It's still in its infancy. You got to remember LED lights are really only got going 15 years ago. That's a technology you're going to see huge changes on. So as I jump through what we're seeing out here today, a lot of this change is being driven by farmers and consumers. And this is really important on both ends of the spectrum. If you think about farmers, what do they want? Farmers want to make money. There's no better entrepreneur than a farmer. My father-in-law was a dairy farmer. I can tell you he wasn't doing it to do good only. He wants to make money. The challenge today is to be a farmer is one of the toughest jobs out there, and technology has not been helpful because most of the technology that's been provided doesn't help improve ROIs for farmers. But let's see what's here today. You see a lot of innovations coming, and what excites me about it, and I think makes farmers much more likely to adopt technology, is the fact that these technologies are not made specifically for the ag sector. They are made for other industries. They've been adopted, they've been shown they can work, and now the ag sector will adopt it. So if you looked at something like CRISPR, CRISPR's been developed for the healthcare sector. You look at advanced materials, that's going in multiple sectors from the industrials to the consumer side. Automation and robotics, we see it in the industrial sector. Data analytics, AI, machine learning are going into almost every sector of the economy. Blockchain and fintech going in to the financial sector. If you're a farmer and you see this being done effectively and successfully in other end markets, it makes it significantly easier to use and adopt because you believe it. The other part's the consumer. This part, to me, is very interesting because you have generational change that's driving a lot of this right now. So you have younger people who are looking for fresher, healthier, more nutritious food going sustainably, and they are going to push the changes that we're seeing. Okay, and as I look out there today, I would tell you, you see some really different changes that are going to make people have to think through how we eat in the future. I see at my house, there's 4 of us, and we might eat differently each day. If you look what people are thinking about, they're thinking vegan, organic, flexitarian, gluten-free, fair trade. If you go back 20 years, most of these weren't words we knew. All of this is really a new way, and it's going to drive how things go. I know I'm coming to the end, but I'll take a couple moments just to talk about what I think is important. So what has to happen for this to become reality? I want to go back to my background. I spent the last 20 years working at the intersection of technology, innovation, and climate change. And really, renewable energy, when I started in 2004, was a tiny industry. There wasn't a lot going on. But things fundamentally changed. Really, if you look back, 1998, 2000, and 2005, in my estimation, fundamentally changed how things in the renewable energy sector work. You had government incentives and policy that were driving change. That is incredibly important. Capital, technology are not enough. You need policy. And if you think about what this did, that's to me the most important. It led to initially equity investment. That's really important because if you're going to have technology, you need equity. And we saw a significant growth over a short amount of time. I think it's fair to say some of what happened in the renewable sector in terms of investment was negatively impacted by the Great Recession back in '08. However, if you move forward and think about what was the key driver, it wasn't equity, it was debt. It was the ability to get inexpensive capital for hard assets to really grow adoption. And if you look on the bottom, look at what happened on the cumulative investment, cumulative installed capacity in solar and how rapidly it came. What does that mean in this sector? It means we need policy initiatives. We have 2 things that have happened in the last couple of years that I think make me very optimistic as to where this sector could go. The US recently passed the IRA, $20 billion, in my perspective, towards a future of a more sustainable ag system. It's a good start, but it's really only a start. To me, what Europe's doing is much more interesting. That being said, I have some real concerns about Europe. Europe's facing major challenges with Ukraine and Russia at its border, and I'm not sure when push comes to shove, if there's food security issues, whether Europe will institute all this by 2030. If they do, it's going to be fantastic and drive innovation, but more importantly, adoption. So I'll finish with this. If you think about where the sector is, we've had an enormous growth in the amount of investment. We've gone from $2 billion in 2013 to $19 billion in 2021. That's a fantastic increase in investment into ag tech from an equity side. Unfortunately, that's not going to make a difference. If you go back again to the renewable energy example, you're talking about how do you put in non-dilutive financing. If you want to grow indoor farming, alternative protein, get the investment in for replacements for fertilizers and other components, it's going to be the non-dilutive financing that we're not there yet on. The final thing I'd say is consolidation and investment is going to be key here. These are sectors typically that have large oligopolies that are leading it. And new companies often will struggle to get market adoption. For success in this sector, while there will be standalone companies that are successful, it's likely we're also going to see partnerships, consolidation, as we did in energy, the utility sector, and mobility and transportation. All of this leads me to say this sector is on the road to success. It's still early, and we need the same initiatives and policy help that renewable energy got to be successful in the long term. And I'm really optimistic we could get there. And I'd love to thank everyone for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you, Adam, for that